What happens when a capital city goes dark, and the silence is not caused by peace, but by precision? In the early hours before dawn on January 3rd, 2026, Caracas entered a state that few modern capitals have experienced in real time, the sudden realization that control of the sky had quietly shifted, not contested, not challenged, simply taken. The night air over Venezuela's capital did not fill with chaos at first. Instead, it filled with order, cold, deliberate, and unmistakably foreign. Shortly after 2 a.m. local time, sharp detonations rippled across select districts. Not the rolling thunder of bombardment, but surgical strikes isolated, measured, almost restrained. Power flickered in sections of the city. Communications stuttered. Radar operators across northern Venezuela began to see patterns that did not make sense at first glance. Aircraft moving not randomly, but with intense speed and coordination. These were not warning shots. They were signatures. Residents would later describe an eerie contrast. Streets remained mostly intact, buildings stood, yet above them something fundamental had changed. The sky itself had become operational territory. Reports emerging through international monitoring channels indicated a multi-layered aerial presence unfolding almost simultaneously, fixed-wing assets, rotary aircraft, and unmanned platforms moving in disciplined choreography. This was not escalation by accident. This was escalation by design. In modern warfare, control of the air is no longer about dominance through destruction. It is about denial, blindness, and tempo. The events over Caracas reflected that shift perfectly. Air defenses were not obliterated in dramatic fireballs. They were muted, confused, bypassed. Sensors were degraded just enough to delay response. Command and control nodes were disrupted just long enough to create uncertainty. In war, uncertainty is often more paralyzing than fear. Within minutes, the illusion of Venezuelan air sovereignty evaporated. The city below did not yet know it, but the operational clock had started. Every second mattered. Every flight path had been rehearsed. Every timing window calculated. This was not improvisation. According to defense analysts familiar with US and allied doctrine, operations of this nature require months, sometimes years of planning, modeling, and simulation. Urban terrain, electromagnetic environments, civilian density, and political fallout are all weighed long before the first aircraft ever lifts off. The most unsettling aspect was not the noise. It was the absence of confusion from the attackers. Helicopter rotors cut through the humid night air along predefined corridors. Surveillance drones maintained persistent overwatch, feeding real-time imagery into command networks far beyond Venezuelan borders. Above it all, stealth platforms ensured that nothing unexpected could interfere. The capital was not under siege. It was under management. For Caracas, this moment marked the psychological pivot of the operation. Before any announcement, before any images reached global audiences, the message had already been delivered quietly, but unmistakably. The state no longer controlled the vertical dimension, and once the sky belongs to someone else, the ground is only a matter of time. This was the opening act of an operation that would reverberate far beyond Venezuela, and as the night pushed toward morning, the city remained largely unaware that history was already moving past it at rotor speed. What followed the seizure of the sky was not chaos, but compression. Time collapsed. Space narrowed. The operation moved from presence to purpose. This was the phase where modern warfare reveals its most unsettling trait, the ability to disable a capital without visibly destroying it. Over Caracas, the air campaign shifted seamlessly from access to dominance, not through brute force, but through synchronization. Stealth aircraft were already in position long before the first helicopters crossed into the city's airspace. Their role was not spectacle, it was silence. Advanced sensors mapped radar emissions, communications nodes, and electronic responses in real time. Anything capable of interfering surface-to-air systems, tracking radars, command relays was either blinded, spoofed, or quietly neutralized. No dramatic explosions, no televised fireballs, just absence. When Venezuelan operators attempted to respond, they were reacting to ghosts. Then came the rotary phase. Low-flying helicopters entered along corridors carved out minutes earlier. Their timing was exact. Their routes were deliberate. This was urban insertion doctrine, refined over 2 decades of conflict from Baghdad to Abbottabad, now executed in a South American capital. The aircraft did not linger. They did not circle. They appeared, delivered, repositioned, and vanished into the darkness with mechanical indifference. Surveillance drones hovered above it all, invisible to most civilians below. Their feeds flowed into command centers far from Caracas, where analysts tracked movement, verified targets, and measured resistance or the lack of it. This was the quiet confirmation that the operation's assumptions were correct. Defenses were not mobilizing. Loyalist units were not converging. The system was stunned, not shattered. Crucially, this phase was about isolation. Roads leading to key districts were disrupted just long enough to prevent reinforcement. Communications between military commands fractured into fragments. Caracas was no longer a unified operational space. It was a collection of disconnected zones. In modern conflict, fragmentation is fatal. A state can survive unrest. It cannot survive simultaneity. It cannot understand. Defense analysts would later note how restrained the strikes were. No power grid collapse. No mass casualties. This restraint was intentional. Excess destruction creates unpredictability. Predictability, in contrast, favors the planner. The objective was control, not punishment. Momentum, not spectacle. Every action pointed toward a narrow window opening and closing at the center of the capital. By the time Masdar operators realized the extent of the penetration, the operation had already moved past them. Response options narrowed with every passing minute. Air assets could not launch. Ground units lacked coordination. Orders, when they came, arrived too late or contradicted each other. This is what dominance looks like in 2026, not overwhelming firepower, but overwhelming clarity on one side and its total absence on the other. The city itself remained largely intact, but its defensive nervous system had been temporarily severed. Caracas was not burning, it was frozen, and in that paralysis, the most critical phase of the mission was about to begin. Because once defenses are neutralized and space is controlled, there is only one question left in an operation of this scale: how long does it take to reach the objective? The moment of capture is rarely the loudest moment in modern warfare. It is the quietest and the fastest. By the time Caracas understood that its defenses had been isolated, the decisive window had already opened. This phase was not about force projection. It was about access verification and speed. The objective was singular. The margin for error was zero. Special operations teams moved along routes rehearsed down to the second. Urban terrain compresses time and magnifies risk. Every corner stairwell and rooftop becomes a variable. Yet the movement that night showed none of the hesitation typical of uncertain environments. Helicopters touched down briefly. Operators disembarked with precision. Perimeters were established not by mass, but by placement angles, elevation lines of sight. The city's density worked against its defenders. Too many structures, too many blind spots, too much noise for coordination. Inside a fortified location in Caracas, the target was confirmed Nicolás Maduro, accompanied by close protection and immediate family. Confirmation protocols were executed rapidly. Visual identification, biometric verification secured communications back to command. There was no prolonged engagement, no drawn-out confrontation. This was extraction doctrine, not occupation. The goal was never to hold ground, only to pass through it. Once custody was established, the tempo accelerated again. Staying on the ground was never an option. Urban operations favor those who leave first. Helicopters were already repositioning engines, hot crews synchronized. Within minutes, the package moved from structure to aircraft. No broadcast, no announcement. In operations like this, silence is not secrecy, it is safety. The psychological impact of this phase extended far beyond the compound itself. For regime loyalists, the realization came too late. The leadership had been physically removed before any coordinated response could materialize. For security forces across the city, uncertainty metastasized into paralysis. Without confirmation, without orders, without leadership, resistance dissolved into confusion. This is where modern power diverges from historical coups. There were no mass defections, no tanks in the streets, no radio proclamations. Control was achieved not through symbolism, but through absence. The head of state was no longer present, and in that absence, authority fractured. Extraction routes were pre-cleared, monitored continuously by overhead surveillance. Any unexpected movement triggered contingency layers already in motion, yet none were needed. The operation encountered remarkably limited resistance, reinforcing a strategic truth seen repeatedly in recent conflicts. Regimes built on centralized control often collapse at the moment that control is physically removed. As the helicopters lifted away from Caracas, the city below remained intact, unaware that its political gravity had shifted offshore. The decisive act was complete. What remained was transportation containment and messaging. And waiting beyond the horizon was the platform that made all of this possible, not a base, not an embassy, but a sovereign extension of American power floating just outside the map. Power did not end with extraction. It transitioned offshore beyond the reach of Venezuelan jurisdiction and domestic law. A different kind of sovereignty waited, mobile, armored, and self-contained. The helicopters did not head toward an airbase or neighboring capital. They flew toward a floating command node designed for exactly this purpose, USS Iwo Jima. Amphibious assault ships are often misunderstood as relics of past wars. In reality, they are among the most adaptable instruments of modern power projection, with expansive flight decks, hardened internal compartments, intelligence facilities, and medical infrastructure. Such vessels function as offshore capitals capable of hosting sustained operations without touching land. That night, the Iwo Jima was not a backdrop, it was the operational center of gravity. As helicopters approached, deck crews were already in motion. Lighting was minimal, procedures were rehearsed. The transfer was fast and controlled. Once aboard, custody shifted fully into U.S. military control. From that moment forward, the mission was no longer about capture. It was about containment, legal framing, and strategic messaging. The choice of a naval platform was deliberate. At sea, ambiguity works in favor of the operator. Jurisdiction blurs. Response options narrow. There are no crowds, no protest zones, no immediate diplomatic leverage. The ship could reposition at will, remain protected by layered defenses, and operate under established rules of engagement. In effect, the detainee was removed not just from Venezuela, but from its political ecosystem. This is a pattern seen increasingly in 21st century operations. Fixed bases signal intent. Ships preserve flexibility. From the Mediterranean to the Western Pacific maritime platforms have become the preferred staging ground for actions that must remain deniable, reversible, or rapidly scalable. The Iwo Jima embodied that logic, perfectly visible enough to matter distant enough to control escalation. Strategically, this phase carried immense symbolic weight. The removal of a head of state to a U.S. naval vessel sent a message not only to Caracas, but to capitals watching closely across Latin America, Europe, and Asia. This was not regime change by invasion. It was regime disruption by extraction, a demonstration that leadership can be removed without occupying territory, collapsing infrastructure, or committing to prolonged conflict. For Washington under a second Trump presidency in 2025, the optics mattered. Strength without quagmire, decisiveness without occupation, prestige without prolonged exposure. The operation aligned with a broader doctrine emphasizing speed, offshore control, and limited footprints, especially in politically sensitive theaters. As the ship altered course and moved away from the Venezuelan coastline, the operation entered its final quieter phase. Diplomats prepared statements, allies recalculated positions, markets reacted, and on land, a country awoke to a reality it had not yet fully processed. The center of power was no longer in Caracas, it was moving across open water. What unfolded over Caracas did not exist in isolation. It fit a pattern that has been quietly solidifying across multiple theaters of conflict, a pattern where power is applied below the threshold of declared war, yet with unmistakable strategic intent. From Eastern Europe to the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific, the same logic is visible: speed over scale paralysis, over destruction, and psychological dominance over territorial control. In Ukraine, the lesson has been learned the hard way. Russian infrastructure and command nodes have increasingly been targeted not to collapse the state outright, but to disrupt continuity, energy grids, logistics hubs, symbolic assets. The goal is rarely immediate victory. It is exhaustion, uncertainty, and the erosion of confidence. The Caracas operation mirrored that logic, precisely substituting missiles with mobility and occupation with extraction. The Middle East offers another parallel. In the shadow conflict between Israel and Iran, strikes are calibrated to send messages rather than trigger wars. Air defenses are tested, red lines are probed, assets are neutralized quietly, often without public acknowledgement. Control of escalation is as important as the strike itself. Caracas followed that script: high impact, low visibility, maximum ambiguity. Then there is the long game unfolding between United States and China. In the South China Sea and beyond, presence matters more than confrontation. Surveillance flights, naval patrols, cyber intrusions, each action is designed to shape behavior without forcing a decisive response. The Venezuelan operation echoed this strategic restraint, signaling capability without triggering a regional firestorm. What connects these theaters is a shared understanding: prestige in the modern era is not measured by how much territory is seized, but by how decisively control can be asserted and released. Caracas demonstrated that a state's leadership can be isolated and removed without tanks crossing borders or flags being raised. That lesson will not be lost on adversaries or allies alike. For smaller states, the implication is sobering. Traditional defenses, armor, manpower, even air defense systems offer diminishing returns against operations that prioritize intelligence dominance and tempo. For major powers, the takeaway is equally stark: credibility now depends on the ability to act surgically and withdraw cleanly. This convergence of doctrine marks a shift in how wars begin and how they are avoided. Violence is no longer the opening move, control is. And as these methods proliferate, the line between peace and conflict becomes increasingly difficult to define. Caracas was not a new chapter, it was a confirmation that the rules have already changed. By morning, Caracas looked deceptively normal. Traffic returned in fragments. Shops opened cautiously. Phones buzzed with rumors, fragments of truth and disbelief. Yet beneath the surface, something irreversible had occurred. The center of gravity had shifted not through mass violence, but through absence. Leadership had vanished. Authority fractured. And millions of people were left suspended between fear and possibility. For ordinary Venezuelans, the operation was not experienced as a tactical triumph or a geopolitical statement. It was experienced as uncertainty. Who governs now? Who commands the security forces? Will borders close? Will violence follow history? Shows that the most dangerous moment for civilians is not the strike itself, but the vacuum that follows. Power abhors emptiness, and emptiness invites competition. Security forces faced the same dilemma. Without a clear chain of command, loyalty became a liability. Acting too soon risked backing the wrong side. Acting too late risked irrelevance. In such moments, states do not collapse with explosions, they dissolve through hesitation. This is where the balance between security and freedom becomes most fragile. Emergency measures promise stability, but often at the cost of civil liberties. Restraint promises legitimacy, but risks disorder. Internationally, reactions were cautious. Some governments called for calm, others emphasized sovereignty, markets adjusted, alliances recalculated. The United States under President Donald Trump in 2025 projected confidence without overcommitment, asserting capability while avoiding occupation. It was a demonstration of prestige, but also a test how much power can be exercised before it begins to undermine the very order it claims to protect. This question extends far beyond Venezuela. In a world where leaders can be removed without invasion, where capitals can be neutralized without bombardment, what protects sovereignty? Is it law, alliances, deterrence, or simply relevance? And for citizens, what does freedom mean when security decisions are made faster than public consent can be expressed? The Caracas operation may prove to be a turning point or merely a preview. What is clear is that the tools of power have evolved faster than the norms meant to restrain them. Precision has outpaced accountability, speed has outrun debate, and the sky, once a symbol of national control, has become a contested domain of influence. As Venezuela stands at the edge of an uncertain chapter, the world is left with a question that cannot be answered by force alone. In an age where control can be seized silently and released just as quickly, who ultimately decides the future of a nation, the architects of security, or the people who must live with its consequences? The operation over Caracas revealed a defining feature of modern power: decisive control without visible war. Beginning with the silent seizure of airspace, the campaign unfolded through precision synchronization and restraint. Defenses were neutralized without widespread destruction, leadership was removed without occupation, and sovereignty shifted not through invasion but through absence. This approach mirrors broader global trends seen in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, where speed, ambiguity, and psychological dominance increasingly replace traditional battlefield conquest. The use of offshore platforms, intelligence-driven targeting, and rapid extraction reflects a doctrine designed to assert influence while minimizing long-term exposure. Yet the most profound consequences are not tactical or strategic, they are human. Civilians awaken to uncertainty, institutions hesitate, power vacuums test the fragile balance between order and freedom. For the United States, the operation reinforced strategic prestige under President Trump's leadership, but also raised enduring questions about accountability and precedent. Caracas stands as both a warning and a signal. In a world where control can be imposed silently and leadership removed overnight, the future of sovereignty depends not only on military capability, but on legitimacy, resilience, and the will of the people themselves.